and then I'll admit all. Ooh. People in the lobby. And what we usually do is
admit everything.
Oh, exactly.
Admit
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah.
Put me up against
Sir Steve Webb calls you young Tom. So Steve Webb likes you. Yeah, young Tom.
As opposed to Tom McPhail, presumably, who's old Tom.
Old Tom. Yeah.
And old Tom was a bit of a tale of abuse, which was basically a term of abuse, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, yeah.
There you go.
That's what I love about pensions. People still refer to me as young. So
young Tom.
It's one of the few avenues of my life where that remains the case.
There we go. Yeah. So thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Pension Playpen Coffee Morning. An audience with Tom Selby. If you've just joined, if you could mute, that would be great. Allowing Tom to say his thing and speak to our amazing chairman, Henry Tapper. Morning, Padraig. Morning, David. Morning, Darren.
Good morning.
More and more people are joining. Admit all. More people joining now. Good morning, everyone. If you've just joined, good morning, Mark. If you've just joined, then please mute. That'll be good.
Hi, Dennis.
Darren's just been running. Have you, Darren, this morning with your hoodie on there? It's very smart. A bit of.
No, this is my slobbing clothes from working from home.
Okay, no, but very nice too.
Haven't got the heating on.
Oh well, yeah, like us all. Yeah, I guess we could do a whole coffee morning on heating, couldn't we? And money saving tips for heating. So there we go. Okay, Ian, if you could mute, that would be good. John Spain, if you could mute. So that'd be good. And just mute John. Okay, I think that's it. We're now 10:32. Give another few seconds, Tom, and then there we go.
Yeah, it's fine. No rush for me.
And William, bring William in. Okay, right, it's 10:33. So Tom, we'll do the introductions as usual. Most of you know the form. First of all, many thanks to Tom Selby from AJ Bell stepping in fairly much at the last minute for this event today. We are going to be touching on the wonderful world of LDI, following on from Con Keating's presentation 2 weeks ago and William McGrath's presentation last week. So LDI will be on the agenda. But what we're going to have is a relaxed interview with Tom. Henry's going to lead the way with some questions. As usual, we're being recorded. So Mark, Michael, Darren, if you're happy, Pedro, thumbs up, being recorded. We'll start the ball rolling. If we do get enough time, I know Con's got a few slides, just to give everybody a sort of post-match analysis, probably for the last 10 or 15 minutes on the LDI debacle as well from a Con Keating point of view. Which will be very reserved, no doubt. So we'll bring on to that. But Henry, over to you as the.
We'll make absolutely sure that we get Con's 10 or 15 minutes at the end. Is that okay, Tom? Don't want to curtail things too much.
That's absolutely fine by me. Yeah.
Now, I was reading Money Marketing earlier this week, as I do, because I don't do any work. I just sit around reading things, and. That was an article from Tom Selby about LDI. I thought, what's going on here? Retail journalist talking about something posh like LDI. It's institutional. Why is he getting himself involved in this debate? And I read the article and I thought, actually, that's bloody good. That's exactly what should be being said right now. And I thought, let's get this man on the Pension Playpen. And goodness me. 30 minutes later, Ben said, look, I've got this big blow up at the Royal Mail. We can't do our 10:30 slot. Is that okay? And I said, I know. I'm happy about that, Ben. I've got just the plan B. And he said, okay, that's fine. He pushed off and in came Tom. So without more ado, can you tell us a little bit about this article you wrote and expand so that everybody knows? I don't know if anyone who's actually read the article put their hand up. Apart from me, yeah. Well done, Mark. Yeah. Okay. All right. So over to you, Tom.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for having me. It's lovely to see most of you. A few familiar faces, a few unfamiliar ones. So probably useful to give a bit of background, I guess, as to who I am and what I do and the kind of the where I was coming at the LDI situation from. So as Henry kind of touched on there, in a former life, I was a financial journalist for money marketing primarily. And then about 6 or 7 years ago, I moved into a role at AJ Bell, and I'm now in a role partly involved in communicating with the media and partly involved in communicating with customers and partly focusing on retirement policy. So the job title is head of retirement policy, but that involves various different things. So in terms of the LDI situation, so I would probably describe myself as an interested observer. So it's not an area that AJ Bell's specifically involved in, but as things started to kick off in that market post mini budget, and in particular as certain very, very senior journalists started to be briefed on exactly what they understood to be going on in the LDI market, and specifically some of the risks that were posed to pension funds, it became clear to me, and I'm sure clear to most people in this room quite quickly, that there was some significant misinformation being put out there. And so in my role as, I guess, speaking to journalists, and I guess a lot of my job is trying to explain complicated things in a simple way that normal people could understand, it became quite clear quite quickly to me that there were lots of people who were like normal people, as in normal savers, who were entirely confused about what was going on here. Now, I think that started with briefings from whoever it may be. It may have been from government, it may have been from Bank of England, to some very, very senior journalists who talked about pension fund insolvencies. Clearly, what you've got here is a marrying, I think, of something very complicated in pensions that a lot of people don't engage with, and something very complicated in gilt yields, and you get the two things smashed together, and you get certain journalists saying that pension funds are at risk of insolvency. That becomes hardened within the debate. And so I ended up having a kind of 72-hour period doing various phonings with, I did one with Nikki Campbell, I did one with a Sky News Q&A for 30 minutes. And the questions that were coming in were absolutely nothing to do with defined benefit pensions. They were nothing to do with LDI. They were barely anything to do with gilt yields. The problem was that the idea of a pensions crisis had been seeded by, I think, a number of actors. So when information gets disseminated, as I'm sure all of you will be aware, there's a lot of things that go into that. So someone like Robert Peston won't randomly be tweeting about the risk of pension fund insolvencies just because he fancies it. He'll have been briefed by someone about the problems that LDI funds were causing and the potential that that was going to create an extra gilt sell-off and was going to potentially destabilize the UK economy. But somewhere in the passing of that information, it felt to me like that was lost, and that any kind of subtlety or nuance of information was lost. And so we've ended up in a situation where clearly there were some significant problems within the LDI market, and I'm sure Con and others have covered the technical details of that, and that's definitely not for me to cover. There's people far more qualified than me to look at it. So there was the specific problems within that market, and then there was the way those problems were communicated to the wider world, and that's where I think things really fell down. And I was right on the coalface for 72 hours speaking to people, not just end consumers, but journalists. And the problem was that the idea that people's pensions were fundamentally at risk became the truth. And as far as I'm aware, and someone may correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I'm aware, nobody was saying that what was going on with LDI funds was going to push companies into insolvency and mean that people were potentially not going to get their full pensions. And obviously, if they did, then the pension protection funds sit behind those DB schemes. So I ended up in a position of having to tour various studios, just trying to calm people down. I probably didn't succeed because I was kind of one little person going around trying to do it. And also, when I was going through some of the Q&As, the challenge was that you would say this isn't going to be, for the vast majority of people asking questions had defined contribution pension schemes that were invested around the world, weren't specifically exposed to UK gilts. But my sense was that people were, there were probably quite a lot of people who might never have checked their pension before, had read pension crisis headlines, had then logged in and checked their pension. Clearly, for lots of people over the last 2 years, their pension pot's gone down in value. They put 2 and 2 together and got 5, and assumed that the pension crisis that was being talked about in the media was resulting in their pension pot value going down, their pension pot being at risk. And the end result of that was people saying, should I withdraw all my money now? Or can I freeze my pension? I didn't even know what that question meant, but someone asked, could I freeze my pension? There was someone who asked, is my state pension at risk as a result of this? So for me, there were 2 things that really came out of that process, and it's kind of away from the mechanics of LDI and leveraging and all the rest of it. One was, I've always been aware of this from a kind of, you read all the research the FCA puts out in its Financial Lives survey and all the rest of it about people not understanding retirement and not understanding pensions. But when you're faced with it and you're actually speaking to genuinely terrified end consumers, you actually see just how much people fear when losing their pension. It's people fear losing their pension, and people are scared of their mortgage, which is what mortgage being hit, which is obviously why this government's found itself in particular problems, because people have thought that both have been put at risk by the government. So there's that part of it, and there's and it was just the lack of understanding of really basic concepts. So most of the people I spoke to didn't even know that their pension was invested at all. So you've got this situation where information has been disseminated in a way which has caused confusion and in a way which has scared people. And then you end up with a situation where there's lots of headlines about pension crisis. And then when you speak to these people, you realise that they're totally clueless about their retirements, totally clueless about how it's invested. And so to me, there were 2 challenges that came out of that. And I'll stop speaking in a second because I've realised I'm slightly warbling on. But the first challenge that came out of it was the immediate. We've got this Work and Pensions Committee investigation going on. I think clearly lots of that needs to focus on the specifics of the LDI market and what's gone wrong there. But my strong view is that part of it needs to focus on what went wrong with the way that information was disseminated from central government and from the Bank of England to senior journalists and ended up becoming the reality, because there's been some serious damage done both to the reputation of pensions generally, even pensions that are totally nothing to do with LDI whatsoever. The idea of saving for retirement has been damaged by what we've seen here, and in the article that Henry mentioned, I kind of raised a few of the things that people still, whenever I still speak to, every now and again, I still play football, and that's quite a nice milieu of different people from different walks of life, and quite often they'll ask me things about pensions, and those who don't trust pensions still raise Maxwell and Equitable Life and all the rest of it, and my fear is that this is just going to be added to that list of things, when actually these are pension scandal headlines where, again, as far as I'm aware, nobody's pension was really at risk at all. It was a problem with the gilt market. So that's that short-term issue of why was information disseminated in a way which led to people being terrified. And then over the long term, it just drove home to me the need to improve people's understanding of basic financial concepts. And I appreciate that's an easy thing to say, and people say it all the time, and I haven't got a solution in mind. I've not come up with one in the kind of 24 hours since Henry asked me to do this, but it needs to become more of a priority, because we're, through automatic enrolment, we're nudging people to save for retirement. They're in a pension, and actually huge numbers of people have got absolutely no idea where their money is invested, what their risks are, what risks they're taking. And the first moment they read a pension crisis headline, they check into their account, their money's gone down, and they're panicking, and they're potentially going to make bad decisions, especially if they're over 55 and they can access their pension. So I think there's clearly the LDI has brought up some very specific challenges for those fund managers who have created those funds and those pension schemes that have used those funds. But to my mind, as as someone who spends most of their life communicating with people and listening to end savers, it actually just drove home how little understanding there is out there of some really basic concepts. And we, in my role, we've been focusing quite a lot on the advice guidance debate, but I think this goes even more basic than that. I think it would be helpful if people could get more useful free information, but we're really talking about the fact your pension is invested in things and it may go up and down in the short term, and people just do not understand that very basic concept. And that was the kind of, I don't know where I'm going to take that, but and it's kind of an obvious point, but it was something that just hardened in my mind as I went through that kind of 72 hours speaking to lots and lots of people who were very confused. You're on mute, Henry. Oh, Henry, you're on mute.
You're on mute.
What a git I am.
Come on, Henry. You're supposed to be the professional here.
I know. It's the professionals like me who needs experts. Now, we've got 2 questions, which is pretty unusual for such an early stage of things. But I'm going to come to Porrick first because Darren asked after. Porrick, you've got your hand up. I'm assuming you're on mute as well, Porrick, are you?
Can you hear me?
Hello, mate.
Hello, how are you?
Yeah, not bad. How are you?
A bit older than the last time you saw me. Look, just a quick question, which that you may or may not have an answer to, but did you get a feel for where the misinformation was coming? Was it just that some of these senior journalists, who are generally personal finance journalists, don't get institutional? Or do you think that perhaps the Bank of England was putting the boot in because somebody caused this shit show that they had to clean up, and they were getting tired of sorry, my dog is now, because he's been ignored, making noise, because they are having to clean up this mess and they're getting tired of interference? Did you get any idea of where that was coming from? Or was it just an unholy mess?
So no, I don't blame your dog, first of all, for whining, having to listen to an LDI debate in the morning. I don't think it's much up. I don't think dogs are into it, are they? I didn't get a sense of that. I mean, given that the people who, from what I saw, the people who were first kind of reporting on this on Twitter, as tends to be the case nowadays, were, I think it was Robert Peston and Ed Conway from Sky, and that was where I think the confusion started. And as I said, I think the challenge is that when people that senior, who are both experts in their field and business/economics focused journalists, what they say becomes the truth. My working assumption would be that it would be somebody very senior at the Bank of England who would be briefing them. That's just my working assumption. I don't know that that's absolutely true, but one would expect that is where the briefing would come from. Whether the problem may have arisen because whoever it was giving that briefing was either didn't understand the issues themselves fully, or was trying to oversimplify, or simply it's just being misinterpreted by the journalist. I think there's all sorts of things that could have gone wrong there.
I think we call this the waterfall of information, don't we? Because like the waterfall of liquidity, we have the waterfall of information, and both of them are liable to cause problems because they wash things away.
Yeah, and once something becomes true, and especially with very senior journalists, once that fact is seeded, whether it's fact or not, that then drives certainly from my view is that's driven all of the coverage from here on in. And again, going back to the radio phone-ins and things, that are the ones I participated in and the ones I've listened to, it was, no matter how much you said that the vast majority of people's pensions are entirely unaffected and most people's pensions are safe, you wasn't heard. You couldn't get back from it. People continually thought that their pensions were unsafe, and they didn't understand why the idea that pensions being at risk had been out there. They assumed because it had been reported and because it had been covered so much, that must be true. And it took huge amounts of work to try to get anybody to believe that this wasn't going to result in millions of people losing everything.
Darren, do you want to come in here, take yourself off mute and have your word? Darren, Phil, are you still out there?
Oh, sorry, me?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Right, quickly then. Tom, brilliant and exciting what you've done in sort of like shaking the tree here. Really, really good. But we ought not to be surprised at this. We know this is a perennial issue. So I don't see there's anything just like, oh, this has happened, we should diagnose it and suddenly do something. The problem has existed. It's there. It's continuing. And
yeah.
To be really cynical, but these people, in a few weeks, it will all blow over and they'll go back to not caring. There's nothing different here.
But what about those who take decisions now? So I mean, it will be. I suspect it will be a small number of people.
Right. So,
that you've got the risk of someone over 55 panicking, whipping everything out.
You're absolutely right. And there's a couple of things we should be doing as an industry. One, stop trying to teach people about pensions, because we keep going on about them, about the technicalities, and they don't understand it. They just want to live their lives. So we need to change the way things are communicated. And you're absolutely right. It's just like there needs to be some safeguards in place. For instance, just doing things to stop people doing daft things like taking all their money out as cash and therefore screwing up either means tested benefits or going over a tax threshold. They're the things we need to. So there's two sides to this. Don't as an industry, don't keep trying to teach people about pensions. Help them understand their lives, and yes, put in the safeguards when they're actually needed. I'm sorry, I've turned into solution mode where I've just
yeah. There's no harm in that, Philip. And I'm sorry for getting you wrong. I couldn't see who you were.
So yeah, so I think that's interesting. I think there are clearly different types of people who have different levels of interest in their finances and their pensions and all the rest of it. Certainly, in the kind of 6-7 years I've been doing this job, some of it involves speaking to the public, some of it involves doing webinars for You Invest customers and that kind of thing. Whenever we do anything that involves pensions, and I appreciate if you're someone who sets up a SIP, you're not necessarily the same as someone who gets automatically enrolled. The interest is higher, much higher than for anything else. Now, I think there's different things. I think I agree with you that getting into the real nitty gritty of pensions isn't what anyone's interested in at all. I think that we need to do better. People need to know at least have an idea of the real basic thing that their money is invested somewhere. I don't think they necessarily need to know everything that's going under the bonnet. Ideally, they would know the risk they're taking. But if more people knew that their money was invested, then when something like this happens, there wouldn't be this kind of existential panic that I'm going to lose everything, or there would at least be less of it. Now, I appreciate that it's one because I know it's a debate that's been going on for a long time, and it's a big challenge, and I'm not sure if it can be solved. The idea of engagement and getting people interested and getting more people to understand how their finances work, it's really difficult, but I think it has to be done. Otherwise, at some point, people need to make a decision with their retirement pot. At some point, that just is the case. For the vast majority of people, you either need to buy,
a lot of people don't have a retirement pot, they have a pension, and some of those people have a non-invested pension. In other words, it's pay as you go, and some people have an invested pension which is backed up by funds. And these you talked about the nuances, but most people have to understand some simple nuances, that is their pension paid by the government? Is their pension paid by their company through funds? Or is their pension something which they manage themselves, or is managed for them on a default basis? That's kind of a basic level of understanding that we have to kind of get to.
We know it's more than that, because there are some people who've got some non-pension savings, and there are some people who actually carry on working part-time in their life. So it's not even just about...
Yeah, there's that as well. But just very specifically on the pension side, did you get a feeling, Tom, that people had any understanding about the differences between defined benefit and defined contribution, or did the vast majority of the people you spoke to just think, I got a pension?
No, absolutely not. And that again was, I had some conversations with people after it, and it's another. I feel like I keep on saying things and saying I've got no idea what the solution is, but that's the honest truth. When you look at it, the very idea that we call a defined benefit and a defined contribution are both called pensions, when they're so fundamentally different and affected by things in such different ways, is kind of ridiculous. And that is partly why we ended up with, I think, some of the communications problems, is because this was a pensions crisis, even though you've got defined benefit schemes which could not, I mean, other than the fact they're trying to pay you money in later life, they could barely be more different in terms of the way they're invested and what their aims are and what the things supporting them are and all the rest of it. And I mean, I'm sure someone at some point will say we need to change the name of it, or so maybe you could have a different name. I don't think that would work. I think it's too, the idea of a pension is too embedded in society. But part of the challenge, I think, is that all pensions are called pensions, even though if you compare a SIP to a DB scheme, they're very, very different.
I'm keen to move on to another question from John, who I know is deeply involved in a pension scheme. So do you want to take yourself off mute, John?
And then we'll come to Chris Radford as well, as who's also had his hand up. So,
I agree. There's a huge amount of lack of knowledge amongst the general public on the types of pensions. I suspect a lot of that is deliberate. Most governmental people are in defined benefit things, so they want the man in the street to think they're in something similar, a defined contribution, but rather than calling it a pension and a saving, one's a pension and one's a savings scheme. But just to your general point, I mean, it was kind of like a conversation that pleased everyone in the audience. It was unclear to me what was the misinformation. So we're all going, yeah, the misinformation is terrible. And each side of the argument, we're thinking it's the other side that's wrong. Were you saying the misinformation that LDI is not a problem, or the misinformation that LDI is potentially a catastrophic problem?
So, but from my perspective, the misinformation was that people might lose their pensions as a result of this. Now, whether it, I think the phrase that was specifically used was pension fund insolvency, without explaining what pension fund insolvency meant. I didn't understand what a pension fund insolvency meant, and there was no attempt to explain the role of the employer, the fact that the solvency of the employer is the key thing, or the role of the PPF. Now, obviously, that can't all be done in a headline, but those initial bits of information that went out were talking about pension funds becoming insolvent. And my first question was, well, then what? If you're giving out this kind of information from, say, the Bank of England or whatever, then there's clearly an end consumer at the end of it. And so if you're communicating that information, I think you need to be very clear about what risks there are to actual people in receipt of those defined benefit pensions. And I don't think that was made clear. And as far, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I'm aware, the idea that the cash calls on LDI investments were going to bring entire employers down wasn't. I've not heard that being discussed. I don't believe that was a risk.
Tom, I think there's a danger, and I appreciate the debate, but you started this off by saying I know nothing about LDI, and then you're saying you're in the middle of the media storm telling everyone it's not a problem. I think that's part of the danger. Now, part of the issue the last few weeks, this became a political issue. So Peston only ever looks at the political angle. How does he make a political angle out of this rather than a technical discussion? But there clearly was, in some views, a real issue about pensions. I mean, the Bank of England's not going to do an intervention because it's got nothing to do on a Friday.
No.
It seriously had to take an intervention to stabilise the market for a reason.
Yeah.
So, and it's very complicated, and we can all get lost in it. Oh, it's too complicated. So let's move on to selling SIPs. But it was really complicated. So I think there's a danger we tried to make it go away. It's like the mayor of Hiroshima looking up saying it's only a single airplane. Don't worry about it. You find out, you soon find out it's a big problem.
I think that's an interesting point, John. But that wasn't. I wasn't saying that it wasn't a problem. I think my focus was entirely on, are people's pensions fundamentally at risk? Yes or no? Now, my understanding, and again, I'm sure there's lots of people who know more about LDI than me who will tell me if I'm wrong. My understanding was that the fear from the Bank of England was a further sell-off of gilts. The fear from the Bank of England wasn't that pension funds were somehow not going to be able to pay benefits to members anymore, or that employers were going to get brought down by what was going on underneath the bonnet of their schemes. Now, I think I'd very much take your point that this is a complicated and nuanced thing, but I think certainly as in the role I took within this, which was going out and trying to reassure people.
There's a danger to try and make it not complicated, okay? And I think that's what he's trying to do. You've gone on and said, don't worry, it's all okay. When actually, it might not have been okay, and pension schemes can go bust. And I mean, the regulator's advice on this appears to be, don't worry, employer contributions can fix this. And so all that adds up. And if you accelerate all that into a 1 or 2 or 3 week period, that can be problematic for pension schemes and for companies. It really can be. The scale of it, I mean, it's a bewildering scale. Our current regulatory model is to divert 3 trillion of DB pension assets onto LDI, quasi-government gilts and bonds. Now, it's quite difficult. It's easy to think of it on one scheme, selling one scheme, but if you think of that as a macroeconomic impact, it really is. Now, whether that is problematic in 3 weeks or 30 years, it's really problematic. And all of what the events of 3 weeks ago was accelerated a process. But just be careful about saying, oh, it's all a bit difficult, so let's not worry about it.
Okay, so I take your point, and I think it's a fair point. I don't think I was saying it's all a bit difficult, so let's not deal with it. So when I think most of the things I've done are recorded, so I can probably dig them out and check back exactly what I said. But I tried in what are usually quite short time slots to explain what was happening and what the challenges were, and then my view was that the way that there was already enough stuff out there suggesting that people were going to lose everything, and people were terrified enough to think that their pensions, whether in a DB scheme or a DC scheme, are under existential threat. And I think the danger is if I go on to some of these things and get too caught up in saying, well, actually, if there's this chain of events, then in 30 years that might bring your employer down. I made the fundamental point that it's the solvency of your employer that is the key thing here.
Between 3 weeks and 30 years, that's the uncertainty. I think what's a valid comment to say is, if you're asked to do that, there's a lot of pensions which are not private sector DB, and they're not immediately affected by this. But it takes a different level of knowledge to understand and be comfortable to say, don't worry for the private sector DB, you're not affected by this. That's all I'm saying. If you're comfortable that's the case, but don't go on and say, don't worry about it for the sake of trying to calm everyone's fear. Sometimes people have to react when there's an issue.
I guess so. Yeah. So I maybe didn't make it clear exactly what I was saying. It was that the fundamental thing that I was saying was that it's the solvency of the employer that's key, and as long as your employer remains solvent, then they've got a duty to pay your pensions over time. Now, I think, in a way, for me to speculate one way or another specifically about LDI investments, even if I was the country's top expert in LDI investments, would be irresponsible. So I would never speculate about whether or not the extent to which that is going to be a problem. But I think to go on there and say that it's the solvency of the employer that's key, and as long as these LDI investments don't bring down an entire employer, which as far as I'm aware wasn't being discussed at the point in time, and if I'm wrong about that, then fine, I'll hold my hands up. But my view was, on balance, that was the best way to go about those interactions. And I take the point, and I know that not everyone will agree with that, and I think it's a perfectly valid point. I think it's one of those things where it is so you've got this meeting of quite complicated stuff involving bond markets, some incredibly complicated investments underneath, and actually DB pensions, which can be pretty complicated as well. And you're trying to explain things to people in a way that is true for the majority.
I think we've got some work going on at the Times at the moment, where they're doing a lot of work about scheme-specific communications. Could schemes be doing more to answer these kind of questions on your behalf, Tom? And why is it all being left to people like you to mop up all the all the questions.
Do people listen to their pension scheme? Do people read stuff from their pension scheme? I mean, I think this is part of the challenge, isn't it?
That's the question which the Times are asking. Is it worth schemes trying to put communications out, or is it worth them simply saying, look, here is a forum for you to discuss this if you're worried? I don't know. I'm going to come to you, Chris, in a second, but I don't know if that sparks further questions from people on the call. But I've now come to Chris. Chris, do you want to ask your question? That's Chris Radford.
Hi, Henry. Thank you.
Hi.
And, hi, Tom. Thanks.
Hi.
That was very interesting. When I first heard about this this event, it seemed to me that when the Bank of England makes a very, very expensive intervention to, in inverted commas, protect pension funds, that it's hard for people not to be worried. And I vividly remember myself taking some very poor decisions back in the 1980s, when on the back of the Maxwell scandal, when I became convinced that all the employers were going to run off with my money, and which was a false concern at the time, but I can see why this is the case. But then to some extent my question has been answered, which is, why was the Bank of England intervening? But because if they are intervening, then there obviously is a problem. But then I was going on to question, have the pension funds been using a risk management tool in the form of LDI that actually is quite dangerous and not free of risk if they need the Bank of England to bail them out, given a certain set of market circumstances that may not have been easy to predict, but then managing risk is about protecting yourself against things that you can't necessarily predict. And so the question for this group really, I thought, have the pension funds and their advisors been reckless in using LDI as a tool, and essentially exposing all their members and their client companies, the employers, to unreasonable financial risk?
I can see that John's still got his hand up. So before I get Tom to answer that question, are you still wanting to come back at what Chris has said?
Yeah, okay. I wasn't planning to, because I'm not very good at taking my hand down. I don't know what button to press. But I think the point is, Chris, I'll learn that in a minute. But I think the point is, Chris, is the understanding of risk, and we've got a model that has been designed on an assessment of risk based on the last 30 years, where we've had stable, free market supporting governments. Let me ask you two scenarios here. If the government falls and Labour gets in, and if that Labour then becomes a hard Labour, okay, let's say Corbyn gets back in. So do you, on that basis, would anyone in this call put all of their money into UK government gilts? Do you think they're absolutely risk-free if we have an election with a Labour government and it becomes a hard Labour left? Now that's the core of it. That the modelling assumption is UK gilts are always risk-free, so the model says let's do that. But we've lost the issue of diversification, understanding long-term market risk. So, and when I spoke to actuaries 5 years ago, so who's got government gilts? Well, none of them. They're terrible value. So the model only works if we accept government gilts are always risk-free. And I can see two scenarios. We have a fall of government, we have a left-leading government says, actually, we're going to default on these because they're all technically gobbledygook. No one understands it. It's all the market, and we're not going to play with the market. And so on that basis, I wouldn't put all of my money in gilts. I'd put some. And that's where it comes down to, what is the assessment of risk? And we've lost the concept of diversification. I mean, it's another broader issue that if you've got 3 trillion invested in gilts, that's invested in the States. It's not invested in the economy and our kids' future, but that's a different philosophical debate. So if you come back to the basic economic model of diversification and risk, we have it's easy for us to redefine our model on a 25-year look back where we've had stable government and stable rates and think, look, there's no risk. Okay. So I think there is risk, but we've lost track of what risk is.
I'll
try and find it.
Go on, Chris. Chris, go on.
As I say, my take on it is that the pursuit of elimination of risk is a fool's errand. and because you can't, and the LDI and this incident reveals that. And it wasn't a Labour government that did it; it was a Conservative government that blew it up. So, so there's any government is quite capable of doing that. So therefore, I think that my question to the investment side of the industry, rather than the communication side, which I think is one thing Tom was talking about, is creating the idea that investment can be risk-free is actually a fool's errand, and that managing a lower level, managing risk through diversification, which I think is something you were alluding to, seems like a better strategy for the industry, rather than this mirage of risk-free, as you say, using government gilts, which then, if it goes wrong, all blows up. And,
Tom, did any of these questions about risk come up in the conversations that you were having with the people on the Sky calls or the whatever?
As in the risk associated with LDI investments?
Yeah.
No.
Did anyone talk about that?
No.
It wasn't even on the agenda.
No. So I mean, we're talking about phone-ins here with actual punters on the street. The majority of people that asked questions and I spoke to, as far as I could tell, didn't even have defined benefit schemes and didn't understand the issues that were at play. And obviously they're incredibly complicated issues. But no, and I think part of the challenge was that a lot of the, clearly when you've got generalist journalists reporting on this stuff, then that becomes a challenge as well, especially when the likes of Peston and Conway from Sky have kind of set the agenda for where we are. Then that it kind of just follows suit. And I've got so much sympathy with the particularly the broadcast journalists who are covering this, because what 1 minute they might be talking about, I don't know, Wayne and Colleen Rooney, and then the next minute they're talking about LDI investments and DB schemes, and it's quite difficult, A, to move from one to the other, and B, to really understand and get the nuance. I can totally understand why those journalists would stick with the kind of pensions crisis narrative, because
did you get any questions from people who did say, look, I've looked at my pension statement and it's 20% down on the year, and I've been invested in what they called a risk-free fund or a gilt or a pre-retirement fund? Did you get any stuff on that?
There was and I think there was I had one person who was in an annuity hedging fund, who didn't realise he was in an annuity hedging fund and wasn't planning to buy an annuity, and was kind of like, what do I do? And obviously I said, I can't give you financial advice, but that's probably not great, and you probably want to have a review with your financial advisor of your strategy. That's obviously a big problem for a lot of people when you talk about the idea of risk-free. Again, hedging's great unless you're in funds that aren't, if you're not going to buy the thing that you're hedging against, then you're kind of screwed. So I think there'll probably be quite a few people who are in that position, but no, the general feeling was of confusion and fear from most of the people I spoke to.
Tom, that's so helpful, and thank you very much indeed for your. I guess if I was a religious person, I'd call it testimony. Yeah.
God,
your witness.
Yeah. I feel like I'm in the dock now.
No. I didn't mean it.
Bible that, Tom.
Yeah.
I think. Well, can I just say, Henry, thanks for that. But Chris, coming back to your point, I think Con very shortly will give you his opinion about the risk taken by advisors and investment.
I was just about to say, let's move on.
So Con will pick up that bit. Tom, there's just one final point. I think Mark Ormston has said regarding actually how are we actually going to go from here. Mark, do you want to ask that question to Tom and see where is this help going to come from? Is that presumably what you're saying, Mark?
Yeah, I was just thinking, going back to Tom's point about, what people are actually saying. So, I do member webinars every so often, and I come in with great ideas, and then all of a sudden they're nothing what people actually want to know about. So it's just a case of, where's it going to come from? Where's the catalyst? Do we need, these pension engagement seasons? Are they going to help with your pensions invested? Is that going to be, cohort number 3? Where do we go with it?
Yeah. Hi, Mark. Nice to meet you. I've seen you on Twitter, but I've never actually met you in person. So hello. It's a good question. I knew I was going to be asked it. I don't know the answer. I think there can always. I think often if there's a drive from government for this stuff to happen, then that helps. Whether, I mean, I'm literally just thinking of things on the spot here, but whether you could have some sort of committee focused on improving outcomes for people. I think the consumer duty might help in retail financial services. So now firms are going to have to be focused on good outcomes and measuring good outcomes and measuring consumer understanding specifically. Then that will help with those people who are invested, hopefully. But I don't pretend that it's an easy problem to solve, and I don't pretend that there's an easy solution because there isn't. Yeah,
Ian,
that's nice.
Ian is a key person in this pension awareness debate, and you've got your hand up. So perhaps you'd like to say something before I turn to John and then Con.
Yeah, I put my hand up before Tom made the point about the consumer duty and the fact that there is a requirement to test consumer understanding, which I think is really, really welcome. I did put what I thought was an interesting blog.
It doesn't, of course, apply to the occupational pension schemes, does it?
No. I mean, but hopefully where let's say they have success in one area, then hopefully good practice will spill over. I'm a born optimist, as a lot of people know. There is a blog that is on the Playpen site about, and I put a link to it, and an awful quote about 35-year-olds saying that they're happy to spend 1 hour learning or engaging with their pensions every year. And that's based on some research that my colleague Aaron Coates did. My solution, and I'm happy to recognize this is not a silver bullet, but will make an incremental difference, is that you need to deliver communications that have an audit trail of engagement. And the reason is because, if you measure whether people are engaging, you're also measuring that they're not. And that gives you an opportunity to refine those communications. So I think that's a really, really important point. Deliver communications that have an audit trail and deliver them in a format that people will engage with. And that, to me, is a step forward. Do stuff with an audit trail and do it in an engaging fashion. And I'd encourage people to read the blog on the Playpen site, because it's quite an interesting snippet of how, with certain approaches to communications, you can actually get through to people. But I mean, I really, really applaud what Tom's done, and being that ambassador or what was the word, almost like a religious defender of this, because I've been listening to this podcast recently called the Missing Crypto Queen, which is on BBC Sounds, and it is a fascinating insight into how inadequate people are and how gullible they are and how vulnerable they are to misinformation. And it's very, very motivational. If you want to do anything about this, I'd suggest listening to the Missing Crypto Queen and then thinking about your communications and how we overcome this kind of herd mentality into, frankly, making poor decisions based on poor information.
I'm going to come on to John quickly, because you still got your hand up, and then I'm going to turn to Con.
Let me go to Con. I've had plenty of time, Henry. Thank you.
Okay, Con, you've got some things to say. Have you got some stuff you want to share as well?
No, there are 2 slides, but I won't use them. Okay. I'll just talk. Actually, my theme was, in common with Tom, going to be that of misinformation, and that is the theme I want to talk of. But before I do, Tom, let me say, in 2002 in Istanbul, I presented work that I did for the OECD, the first recommendation of which was that we stop referring to DC pensions and started referring to tax-advantaged savings plans, retirement savings plans. I got voted down 37-1. It was a good start. Sources of information and misinformation in here. My understanding is that early on, i.e. before the crisis really developed, it was the pensions regulator who was being dismissive of there being any problem to other regulators. And that they subsequently changed in the course of the weekend to being, my God, this can all be an absolute disaster. We've got to start doing things. The next point I think which has to be made, and made in spades, is the bank did not intervene to save pension schemes, LDI, or anything like that. They stepped in order to maintain market integrity in the gilt market. And that is emphatically why they only operated in the conventional gilts until the very end of the program. In fact, it's also the reason that there were several days on which they bought no securities in the reverse auctions. They thought that the prices that were being offered were unreasonably high. So there was an element of penalty, as there should be, to offering state money to bail people out. Now, that's the basic points that I would like to make in response to your thing. Was LDI bound to fail? Yes. It's been intrinsically flawed all the time, and yet we are seeing some increasingly vociferous attempts to modify in some way or another LDI and various things. It calls for collateral transformation mechanisms. Call in the FT today to start using high quality collateral instead of cash. That's the way the repo market used to be. That's the way the repo market was when I operated in it. Then we saw in 2007-9 that you get disputes. The collateral you're offering, there's an argument over the price. Then there's an argument over the haircut. Haircuts should vary depending on market volatility. Then there's an even bigger problem, which is you lodge collateral every day for the last month. And of course, the collateral that you've lodged when it's not cash has gone down in price. So you've now got to find a top up to the collateral you've already found. The result just gets to be a total and utter mess. It should not be done. We stopped doing it for a very good reason. As for this idea that we should have a liquidity transform machine, yes, I'd like a magic money machine as well. People buy illiquid securities because they yield more than liquid. If you want, and it's liquidity which has a cost, not illiquidity which commands a premium. You have to spend money to convert an illiquid into a liquid. So if people want to pay that price, and that price in times of distress could be very high indeed, of the order of 40 or 50% of the value of an illiquid security. It's one of the reasons, if you want an idea of how liquid things really are, look at the Bank of England's haircut table. It's very detailed, and it shows both by qualities of material and by their terms what they consider the appropriate haircuts to be. And they vary from 0.5% to 42%. Okay. Could this have damaged companies? Yes. Had it gone on for another 2 or 3 days, we would have seen probably 200 to 300 sponsors of DB schemes which could not pay the sorts of claims which would have been coming in from their schemes as a result of their failed LDI strategies. That would have been a nightmare. It's also a very low probability. Well, actually, in the absence of bank intervention, that's close to a certainty. Okay, these spirals do not extinguish themselves naturally. They need external events, just as they need external events to start them. It happens that the external event we had was an economically illiterate mini budget in a market which was febrile, to put it mildly. We'd just seen a Bank of England rate rise, which actually was a bit disappointing. It should have been higher. But the shocks on the Thursday and the Friday were quite small, 2.5% in the 15-year on the Thursday, 3% in the 15-year on the Friday. And on that day, I gather there were some funds already in selling gilts. So why did the bank subsequently buy some index-linked gilts? Well, the way it was described to me was the debt management office called Cunliffe and said, look, I do rather want to issue about a third of next year's debt in that form, so please can I have a market? Okay, not done to bail out LDI. It's been presented in that way almost invariably. But in fact, if you look through history, the cheapest form of government finance we have ever enjoyed has been the index-linked market. Now, there are no end of the misinformation machine is working overtime now. I wrote a few comments, and it is coming from some quite serious bodies. I wrote a few comments on the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries statement on LDI, which is really, those comments are in a comment on Henry's blog on LDI, but I'll just read you a couple of points, right? And this is the IFOA. LDI was developed as an attempt to balance long-term obligations to provide pensions with a need to protect for short-term funding so that pension schemes can meet their legal obligation to ensure stability of the scheme. There is no such legal obligation as to ensure stability. It's an invention of the IFOA. And, it's the rest of the thing is equally outrageous. The comments are on Henry's blogs. You can read them there. I did provide 2 slides to this, which you're welcome to put up, Steve, and people can see the other ones. There's another piece which we will be publishing as a blog. There was an article by Abdullah Naufal of Insight in the FT, which claimed that his was a different view of LDI, when in fact it's actually entirely the conventional LDI sales pitch. We were sufficiently pissed off by it, and that's the only way to put that, but we decided to write a complete fisking. That is, we looked at it sentence by sentence and found what was wrong in each and every sentence within the article. That will appear as a blog later this week, but first we have another blog which is more technical in nature, which we will be releasing after we've briefed the House of Lords industry and regulators researchers this afternoon. The thing I want to say is the problem is not liquidity. Liquidity is a symptom, and it's a symptom of a very, very nasty disease. And it all actually starts with the accounting standard, which is fundamentally misconceived. Using market prices to value your pension liabilities is nonsensical. It introduces the volatility of market prices, which no one can explain, at least not with any degree of satisfaction, into the valuation of long-term obligations, which had naturally fixed rates at which they should have been amortized. We'll cover the way in which you can do the accounting in the second half of the blog that we are releasing this afternoon. Henry, I think, will publish it tomorrow, and it'll be on Playpen tomorrow. I really am close to my wit's end on this stuff, because I keep seeing there is a clear attempt to say this is a problem of liquidity. It isn't. Liquidity is the symptom. The problem is what's going on here. The other thing which is patently obvious is that there is no regard being paid by the promoters of LDI to the collateral damage that they've done. And Tom, an awful lot of DC holders, like all of them just about, are now a lot poorer than they were before this happened. I've got a friend who's retiring at Christmas. Well, he's not retiring at Christmas anymore because his pot was down by 35%. So he's actually gone back to his employer and said, when I finish my January Caribbean cruise, can I come back 3 days a week for 2 years? And they actually said yes to him because his plans, his retirement plans, have had to be completely rejigged. It's there in mortgages. It's all over the place.
Colin, I'm going to have to rein you in, old chap, because we've reached the end of our allotted hour.
One last
so you're going to have to
thing,
wrap
Henry.
up on this. Yeah.
One last thing. Most of these advocates of LDI say it worked perfectly for 20 years. It didn't. The problems we see now in a negative spiral were present in a positive spiral all the way through. We saw gilt prices driven to levels that they would not have reached otherwise, most notably and visibly those of index-linked gilts. 10 years at 320 basis points under RPI. It made no sense at all. We saw stock market performance as being lackluster because these schemes were consistently and steadily selling UK equity.
So you're saying that there's a market distortion created.
Henry, can I?
Okay.
Let's ask John. John's got his hand up. Yeah. John, go on. Yep, go on.
Just one word. I mean, the question was, what do we do next? I agree with everything. I'm aligned with Colin on most things apart from the accounting standard. I think that's a bit of a red herring, but let's not go into that. You need to ask who benefits from this. I had a dinner with a pension minister 9 years ago, and I said, look, we're starting to take too much money out of pension schemes. And his answer to me was, by basically, the regulatory direction was sell your assets and buy gilts. And so who gains from all this? His answer to me was, yes, we do need rather a lot of money, don't we? It was no attempt to defend the model. And so what is happening here is there's a government of any colour that needs to get a lot of cash. And the easy place to get it, and it's all happen chance is from DB pension schemes. And so our job, and the great thing about pensions, everyone who's in it doing it, and we have a commitment to my 25,000 bus drivers, okay? Yeah. But our job is to challenge and to diversify. I don't know whether gilts are a good investment, or Facebook's a good investment, or Amazon. I don't know. So what I do there, because I don't know, because I'm not infallible, I do not believe in the infallibility of the LDI model. So if we don't know what to do, we diversify. So go back to who gains from this whole model, the transition of 3 trillion of investment assets into gilts, and who loses. And then you got onto what the broader consequence of all that. And I agree with everything else that Connor said. The macro effect is huge. Our job should be to challenge and invest.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to have to now try and bring all of this together, because Tom has been very patient and listened for the last 15 minutes, and Con was very patient to listen to the first 40 minutes. But we do need to sort of like try and work in our heads what's actually been said today. And I think there's two things that have come about misinformation. First of all, what's got through to the public has been incomplete, and possibly it has actually been wrong. And what is coming out of the pension institutions, whether they're the actuaries or the regulator or whatever, has not been consistent and has not been helpful. Yeah. So what we have at the moment for the consumer is an absence of good quality information, and neither do they know what's going on, nor do they know why things have happened. Yeah. And for that reason, the public confidence in this pseudo pension crisis, which everyone says isn't a pension crisis, but clearly was a pensions crisis, is baffling. People are genuinely baffled, and there is no sense in it. And we've got a number of inquiries coming up from the Treasury Select Committee, from the Work and Pension Select Committee, from all kinds of people who are going to be saying what happened. And we need clarity on what happened, what is happening so it doesn't happen again, and so the public can feel that they are secure from these kind of issues. And I don't think we're going to get it. From everything I've heard today, I don't think we're going to get it. But we have to keep pushing for clarity and for transparency. If we don't, then we will just get the kind of bafflement which creates insecurity in people's and leads to bad behaviours, such as the ones that have been outlined this year. So,
Tom,
I think if I can, sorry, you're about to say something, Steve.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Tom, listening to Con, as usual, fantastic analysis. John's questions, Chris's questions, Mark's statement. Now you know what we think, partly, Tom. Has that helped you? Has that sort of sharpened your pencil on consumer education, on consumer well-being? We as an industry need to do a lot more. But Tom, what would be your final words, hearing what Con has now said, the questions from Chris and the question from John?
Thank you. So first of all, thanks for having me. It was really enjoyable. I think it's always incredibly useful to speak to people and get people's views, both about the different issues, but also the way that people like me and others are going about their job. I think that's useful. I think I appreciate me going before Con rather than after. I would have been kind of like a dancing monkey going after the Beatles, which would have been slightly challenging. I think it's good to have the fluff first and then the meat later. I think it's good to hear that. I think there is kind of some broad agreement on the points that you raised at the end there, Henry, which I think is a good thing. I think the one thing I think that John set out there is the kind of passion and enthusiasm from people within pensions has always been very obvious to me since I started as a cub reporter on professional pensions in whenever it was 2009. I think sometimes there's an impression that comes across that, I don't know, the pensions industry is just trying to fleece people out of all their money and doesn't really give a shit about end consumer outcomes. And my experience has never been the case. People do care. People come from it from their own specific position, and some of it's vested interests, and some of it will be based on their own experience. But I think people genuinely do care in ensuring that people end up getting a decent outcome from their retirement pot and aren't terrified at the prospect of retirement and saving up and all the rest of it. So I think that's a positive thing, and I think I'll reflect on, I guess, the way I hope that I always reflect on the way that I talk on some of the when I'm doing some of these broadcast things and the way that I speak to journalists. And I think that has certainly been one thing that I think I mentioned it in the article, one thing that I reflected on after seeing what I viewed as being quite scaremongery headlines and the reaction, and then speaking to actual people about how they felt, was the role of people like me, as well as the other people within the industry, in setting the tone, I guess, for the way that we talk about people's retirements. And I'm not going to pretend that I've always got that perfectly right. I'm sure there's been times when I've over-egged the pudding on something and suggested that something was incredibly big and incredibly scary when actually that wasn't the case. And I think, having listened to everyone's views here, that's something that I'll certainly reflect on.
Yeah. Cheers, Tom. That's absolutely fantastic. Thanks to Tom. Thanks to Con. Really appreciate that. Thanks for everybody's input. Next week, we have the pensions regulator speaking. Ooh. Lucy Stone will be talking about pension dashboards next
Steve,
Tuesday.
Can I chair that one?
Can you what? Can you chair it?
That one.
Yeah, all right then. Okay, well, we'll see where we go.
Regulator.
Try not to go off piece too much, Con, but yeah, we could.
It is on the pensions dashboard, Con.
It's on pensions dashboard, Con. You can't shoot them. You can't shoot them dead on the spot. But there we go. So we've got the regulator. We've got the regulator on next week. Really appreciate everybody's input. Let's pray for peace in the East as usual. Rishi Sunak is now officially Prime Minister, so let's see how that goes, and let's see if we get some stability on the markets. Really appreciate everybody's time this morning. If you're not a member of Playpen, please join. In the next few days, you're going to get a survey from us asking about how it's all going and what you'd like to see from Playpen. So we'll send a survey out later this week. Hope you've enjoyed it. Be safe, everybody, and thanks for everybody's input, and enjoy the rest of your day. And cheers, Tom. Cheers, Con.
Cheers.
Yep.
Nice to see you all.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers.
Cheers. Bye. Bye.